Lost your phone? Battery died? GPS not working? Congratulations. You're now experiencing about 1% of what medieval travelers dealt with every single day. While we panic when we can't find the nearest coffee shop, these folks had to figure out how to cross entire continents. Back then, even the simple act of going to visit your grandmother in the next village could turn into an epic adventure. It's kind of like those video games where you start with a simple quest and somehow end up saving the entire kingdom. Except instead of fighting dragons, you're just trying really hard not to end up in the wrong country. That's why medieval travelers would have killed for even the most basic map. Though what actually passed for maps back then might make you appreciate your glitchy GPS a whole lot more. Because these weren't your typical "you are here" kind of maps. They were more like a mix between an art project and a fantasy novel with a sprinkle of "I'm pretty sure I saw that in a dream once" thrown in for good measure. In fact, many medieval map makers never actually traveled to the places they drew. They just collected stories from travelers, mixed them with local legends, and sometimes threw in a dash of pure imagination. It's like playing a game of telephone, but instead of a message getting mixed up, you end up with a map showing a mountain made entirely of diamonds next to a forest full of two-headed people. The most famous medieval map, the Hereford Mappa Mundi from 1300, puts Jerusalem smack in the center of the world. Around it, you've got your standard geographic features like rivers and mountains, but then things get interesting. There are drawings of people with faces in their chests, a land where folks hop around on one giant foot, and my favorite, a region where people apparently lived off the smell of apples. Talk about a weird diet plan. But it gets better when these map makers have a special talent for filling in empty spaces on their maps. You know how modern maps have those boring, here be nothing much areas? Medieval cartographers thought that was way too dull. Instead, they jazzed things up with sea monsters, dragons, and creatures that looked like someone described a giraffe to them through 5 different people who'd never seen one. One map even showed a group of islands where the sheep grew on trees. Yes, you read that right. Tree sheep. Kind of makes you wonder what those map makers were drinking during their lunch breaks. The shocking news is that merchants actually tried to use these maps. Can you imagine trying to navigate using directions like sail past the island of dog-headed people, take a left at the giant whirlpool that leads to hell, and if you see the fish that's bigger than Ireland, you've gone too far? It's no wonder some trading voyages that were supposed to take a few weeks ended up lasting months. Most of these maps weren't even drawn to scale. A city might be shown as bigger than an entire country just because the map maker thought it was more important. It would be like drawing your favorite coffee shop larger than the entire state of Texas on a modern map, which honestly sometimes feels accurate on Monday mornings. But before you judge these medieval cartographers too harshly, at least they made getting lost a lot more entertaining. Instead of your GPS saying recalculating, you could blame your wrong turn on trying to avoid that fire-breathing snake that was definitely marked on the map. Of course, when maps were this unreliable, medieval travelers had to find other ways to get around. Usually, this meant asking the locals for directions. Which way to London? Might sound like a simple question today, but in medieval times, it often led to some of the most confusing conversations in history. Before smartphones and road signs, locals were basically walking, talking GPS units, except they didn't always agree on where things were, and sometimes they'd send you on a wild goose chase just for fun. Medieval travelers quickly learned that asking for directions was an art form. It wasn't just about the question, it was about who you asked. Merchants were usually your best bet since they traveled regularly. Farmers knew their local area like the back of their hand, but might accidentally send you 2 counties over because they didn't realize there was more than one village called Milltown. And then there were the local teenagers of medieval times who apparently enjoyed giving wrong directions just as much as modern kids enjoy posting prank videos. A historical record from 1267 actually mentions a man who spent 3 weeks trying to find his brother's house in the next town over because everyone he asked gave him different directions. He finally made it, only to discover his brother had moved to another village 2 weeks earlier. Talk about a family reunion gone wrong. The language barrier made everything even more interesting. Latin was supposed to be the common language, but let's be real, most people barely spoke their own local dialect clearly, let alone Latin. One German merchant in 1342 ended up in Scotland instead of France because he misunderstood the word for north. At least he got a good story out of it, and probably some really confused looks from the locals. Some clever locals turned giving directions into a business. They'd hang around popular crossroads and offer to guide travelers to their destination. For a fee, of course. It was medieval Europe's version of a ride-sharing service, except instead of a car, you got a person who might or might not actually know where they were going. According to some old court records, one particularly entrepreneurial guide in France made a living by walking people in circles for days before mysteriously disappearing with their payment. Villages eventually caught on to how bad the situation was getting. Some even started putting up crude signposts, though these weren't always helpful. One famous story tells of a sign that read, "To London," pointing in 3 different directions. When asked about it, the villagers said it was accurate because all roads lead to London eventually, if you walk far enough. But while asking locals could be hit or miss, at least you had a chance of getting somewhere. The real challenge came when travelers had to tackle the medieval roads themselves. And trust me, calling them roads is being pretty generous, because the word road in medieval times meant anything from a decent dirt path to that spot where slightly fewer trees are growing. Most of these roads started as animal tracks that people just kept using until they became proper paths, though proper might be stretching it a bit. And it's like how your local park gets those unofficial shortcuts where everyone keeps walking through the grass, except these shortcuts eventually became major trading routes. Did you know that most medieval roads were actually built on top of old Roman roads? The Romans were amazing builders, but by medieval times, their roads had been neglected for centuries. It's a bit like inheriting a really nice car from your grandparents, but never changing the oil. Eventually, you're just driving a very fancy-looking problem. Studies show that by 1200, about 70% of Roman roads in England were still being used, just in much worse condition. Some medieval roads were so bad that villages had actual laws about how many horses you needed to rescue stuck carts. In one English town, if your cart got stuck in a muddy road, the nearest farmer was legally required to help pull you out, but they could charge you based on how badly you were stuck. There are court records of people arguing over whether being axle-deep in mud was worth 2 chickens or 3 in rescue fees, but it's interesting how these roads kept changing. A perfectly good path in summer could become an impassable mud pit in winter. Some roads would literally disappear underwater during rainy seasons, leading to the totally reasonable medieval practice of hiring local guides whose entire job was knowing which roads were currently underwater. One medieval writer complained that he took the same route 3 times in 1 year and ended up in 3 different places because the road kept moving. Markets and fairs could actually change where roads went. If a town started holding a popular market, people would create new shortcuts to get there, and suddenly the main road would shift. It's like if everyone started cutting through your backyard to get to a new coffee shop, eventually that becomes the official route. Historical records show one road in France that gradually moved almost a mile over 50 years as people kept trying to find better ways around a particularly nasty swamp. The phrase "the road less traveled" had a very different meaning back then. It usually meant this one might actually have fewer bandits, rather than anything poetic. But at least travelers weren't completely on their own out there. That's where professional guides came in. Hiring a medieval guide was like picking a travel agent, hiking buddy, and bodyguard all rolled into one. Except their Yelp reviews were basically just tavern gossip. These guides were the original GPS, but instead of a soothing voice saying, "turn right," you got a grumpy local who might be leading you to either your destination or their cousin's robbery setup. Some guides were actually pretty legit. Records from 1234 show that in certain parts of France, guides had to pass tests proving they knew the area. They'd have to name every village, point out safe places to camp, and even know which local nobles were more likely to welcome travelers versus those who might throw you in their dungeon for suspicious wandering. One guide famously failed his test when he couldn't remember which lord had recently gotten married. Apparently, avoiding angry ex-fiancés was part of medieval route planning. The really professional guides even had specialties. Mountain guides would brag about knowing paths that goats wouldn't take. Desert guides could supposedly smell incoming sandstorms. Forest guides claimed they could talk to birds, though that might have just been clever marketing. By 1300, some European cities had actual guide guilds, medieval unions that made sure their members knew what they were doing and weren't just random people with a good sense of direction. But not all guides were created equal. One medieval traveler's diary mentions paying a guide who fell asleep while walking and led their group in circles for 3 hours before anyone noticed. Another record tells of a guide who knew every shortcut in the region, but had such a terrible sense of timing that his 2-day journey estimates usually meant somewhere between 2 days and 2 weeks. And some places actually had laws forcing guides to pay for lost time if they got travelers lost. 1256 law from Italy stated that if a guide got drunk and lost the way, they had to pay for every hour wasted with either money or chickens. Apparently, chickens were medieval Europe's backup currency. There's even a record of one guide paying a group of merchants with 17 chickens and a very apologetic goat after leading them to the wrong city. Professional guides also had to deal with some weird job hazards. Bears, sure. Bandits, obviously. But how about the time a guide had to convince a group of merchants that the strange lights they saw weren't fairies trying to lead them astray, but just some kids with lanterns trying to catch frogs at night? All in a day's work. When night fell, though, even the best guides needed help from above. And I'm not talking about divine intervention, it's the stars that became everyone's backup navigation system. And that's when night navigation in medieval times turned every traveler into an amateur astronomer. The stars were like the world's first GPS satellites, except they didn't need charging and never had software updates. The North Star was the medieval equivalent of Google Maps' blue dot, always telling you where you were, provided you could find it among all the other dots in the sky. Medieval sailors were particularly good at this star-reading business. They had to be. One wrong calculation, and instead of reaching Portugal with their cargo of wine, they'd end up trying to sell it to polar bears. These sailors could read the night sky so well that they could tell their latitude just by measuring the height of certain stars above the horizon. Not bad for people who still thought the world might be flat. A study of medieval shipping records shows that crews who could navigate by stars had about 60% fewer unexpected destinations than those who couldn't. That's medieval speak for, we meant to go to Venice, but somehow ended up in North Africa. One captain's log from 1298 proudly notes that he only got completely lost twice in 20 years, a medieval 5-star rating if there ever was one. But the sailors passed this knowledge by creating memory rhymes about the stars like Follow the Drinking Gourd, which wasn't about actual drinking or gourds, but about using the Big Dipper to find north. Some of these rhymes were so catchy that modern astronomers have found people still using them in remote fishing villages hundreds of years later. It's like the medieval version of that earworm song you can't get out of your head, except it actually helped you not die at sea. But star navigation wasn't just for sailors. Land travelers used them too, though sometimes with hilarious results. One medieval merchant wrote about confidently following the North Star for 3 nights, only to discover he'd been following a particularly bright lantern hanging from a very tall church steeple. Another complained that his star-reading skills were perfect, but clouds kept appearing just to spite his journey. The truly dedicated travelers learned to read dozens of constellations, creating mental maps that connected the dots in the sky to paths on Earth. Though occasionally, this led to conversations like, I'm sure we should turn left here. The giant celestial bear says so. Followed by, that's not a bear. That's a smudge on your astronomy chart. Of course, star navigation had one obvious flaw. It only worked at night. When the sun came up, medieval travelers needed a whole different set of skills to keep from getting lost in broad daylight. The sun was medieval Europe's most reliable GPS, mainly because it was really hard to miss. Unlike today's satellites that occasionally need to recalculate, the sun had a pretty solid track record of rising in the east and setting in the west. Though there was that one time in 1194 when a merchant group waited 3 hours for the sun to turn on before someone realized it was just really cloudy. Medieval travelers developed some pretty clever tricks for using the sun to navigate. They'd use their hands to measure the sun's height above the horizon. Each finger width represented about 15 minutes of daylight. Though this system had one obvious flaw, people with different sized hands kept getting different results. One record from 1256 mentions 2 merchant groups arguing for hours because the guy with tiny hands thought they had 3 hours of daylight left, while the one with massive hands insisted they only had 1. Monks were particularly good at solar navigation because they already tracked the sun's position for their daily prayers. They even built their monasteries so certain windows would light up at specific times, medieval clock towers without the clocks. A study of old monastery buildings found that about 85% of them were aligned perfectly with the sun's path, which is pretty impressive considering some modern buildings still can't figure out where to put the windows to avoid blinding everyone at sunset. But the sun wasn't just about direction, it was also about timing. Medieval people had this neat trick where they could tell the time by looking at their shadow. The longer the shadow, the earlier or later in the day it was. Of course, this led to some interesting situations. One court record mentions a merchant who was late to an important meeting because he was a very short man following a very tall man's shadow schedule. The real pros combined sun position with local landmarks. They knew that in their hometown, when the sun hit the church spire just right, it was time for lunch. This system worked great until someone built a taller building and messed up everyone's dining schedule. There's actually a complaint from 1287 where a whole town demanded a new watchtower be torn down because it was causing widespread confusion about proper meal times. Some clever travelers even made portable sundials, though these weren't exactly your typical garden variety. One surviving example is basically a stick with probably morning and definitely afternoon carved on different sides. Another was so complicated that its owner's notes included the warning, "If you can read this, you're holding it upside down." Of course, when clouds covered both the sun and stars, medieval travelers had to rely on other clues. That's where understanding natural landmarks came in handy. It is the medieval version of street signs, though they weren't exactly what we'd call reliable. Turn left at the big oak tree. Sounds simple enough until you realize the forest has about 50 big oak trees, and the one you're looking for got struck by lightning last month. A survey of medieval travel journals shows that about 40% of recorded navigation mistakes involve confusion over landmarks. One particularly unlucky merchant in 1245 spent 3 days following what he thought was the same river, only to discover he'd been zigzagging between 3 different rivers that kind of looked alike. Churches were actually some of the most useful landmarks. They were tall, usually pretty unique looking, and most importantly, they didn't move. Medieval travelers would memorize sequences of church towers like we memorize street names today. Though this system had its quirks, one traveler's guide from 1267 includes the helpful advice, "If you see 3 church spires, you've gone too far. If you see 4, you're reading this too late." Mountains were another favorite reference point, though medieval people had an interesting way of describing them. Historical documents show travelers referring to mountains by what they looked like rather than their actual names. This led to gems like the mountain that looks like your Aunt Margaret when she's angry, or the hill that resembles a sleeping dog if you squint really hard. Surprisingly, these descriptions often worked better than proper names because everyone could agree on which mountain looked like an angry ant. Rivers were tricky customers in the landmark department. Sure, they were easy to spot, but they had this annoying habit of changing course over time. A merchant's guide from 1289 actually complains about a river that moved itself overnight after a flood, leading to an entire village waking up to find their turn right at the river directions now led straight into a newly formed swamp. The really clever travelers learned to read the landscape like a book. They'd notice things like moss growing on the north side of trees. Though this wasn't always accurate, medieval records include several heated arguments about moss that clearly hadn't read the navigation manual. They'd look at how the wind had shaped trees over time, check which side of hills had more vegetation, and even pay attention to where animals made their homes. One of the most reliable natural landmarks turned out to be animal paths. After all, animals had been figuring out the best ways to get around long before humans started drawing maps. Though following animal trails did occasionally backfire, there's a hilarious account of a merchant group that confidently followed what they thought was a trade route, only to find themselves at a very surprised bear's favorite berry patch. Looking back at all these navigation methods, from stars to suspicious moss formations, it's amazing medieval travelers ever got anywhere at all.